I'm not going to do that today because I think, this is probably a very educated audience. There are tons of resources out there. The one thing I do like to point out, kind of whenever I'm given, a microphone, is that language, we made up language, right? Like we made up the rules for language, and so we can change those rules. And so I know that typically people sometimes get caught up in terminology and language, and that's completely fine. But at the end of the day, language is serving us and not the opposite. And then just a quick note about the word queer as well, just because I hear a lot of kind of confusion about the term. So as many of you I'm sure know, this was originally a slur against the queer community, and it's a word that has been reclaimed. And so, some community members feel pretty strongly that only people within the queer community should be able to say this word. Other people don't feel that way. And so I just bring this to light just as you're working with LGBT people, just if you use the term to kind of know the history behind it. Another quick note, I think, again, this is a very educated audience, so I don't think I need to kind of list all of the studies that show that LGBT people are at higher risk for mental health disparities, physical health disparities, minority stress, etc. When it comes to LGBTQ veterans, they are often at even higher risk for health disparities. The interaction between their queer identity and their veteran identity often confers even higher risk. So just something to be aware of. And then really what we want to do is move away from the focus on how hard it is being queer, right? Which it is sometimes. But I think the trick in therapy is really, really validating the pain that people have gone through, and then fostering a resilience that's different for every person, right? And so we really have to honor both pieces of that. So today I'm going to try and focus on more of the second piece. If you're interested in a really cute movie about LGBTQ vets, I throw this out there. It's getting old now, which kind of makes it even cuter, but it's kind of a good intro into some really nice veteran stories. I think it's free as well if you Google it. Okay, so getting into our agenda, I'm going to break the talk into 3 pieces. So first, I'm going to just give an overview of what VA currently has to offer for LGBTQ veterans. I think this is important because I think there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding among the people at large and also veterans about what services we offer and what kind of environment we are. And then I want to move to talk a little bit about just some themes that have come up in my work as well as in the literature, and some strategies for addressing those themes. And then for the latter third of the talk, I'm going to talk about specific to supervision. So some themes and strategies for providing clinical supervision for any kind of trainee, regardless of their identity, who's doing this type of clinical work. Just a brief, I know Minna already mentioned, but so I've actually been in the VA since internship, so I've never worked anywhere else. So I'll be talking about doing therapy in the VA, and I also only do group therapy right now. But I'm hoping that kind of these themes and strategies can cut across treating LGBT, not only veterans, but people kind of across settings. Okay, so in terms of VA policy, I know you all had a speaker already as part of this series who dove more into some of the discriminatory history of Department of Defense policy and VA policy. So I won't dive too deep into that now, but I think it is important to know, just briefly, I think most people have heard of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That was enacted by Clinton, and then Obama got rid of it in 2011. And then more recently is what's known as the trans ban. And so this is what our former president put into place restrictions on how and if trans people could serve in the military. The reason I think these policies are important to just be aware of is because a ton of our veterans served during these service periods, and so it's really relevant to them. I work with a lot of veterans who are actually discharged as a result of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And so they have a lot of like trauma and, struggle surrounding that. So I just mentioned that so it's on people's radars. But so currently, the VA has kind of two major directives. So the first one is the directive about specific to sexual orientation. So this is for lesbian, gay, and bisexual veterans. And then the second one is the directive for trans and intersex veterans. And both of these directives were updated as recently as this year. So they're pretty up to date. And there's a link here if people are interested in reading them. I'm just going to point out some things that I think are important about both. So starting with the LGB directive. So the department that's in charge of everything LGBT within VA is the LGBT Health Program. And this is a national office. They are part of VA Central Office, which is what VACO stands for. If you're ever interested in kind of where the VA is going or initiatives or things like that for queer vets, they're the place to start. And then the directives also mandate that there should be an LGBT veteran care coordinator at every VA healthcare system. So this is kind of a point person for LGBTQ veterans. I think it can be really useful for providers outside of the VA if they are working with a queer vet to just know that this person exists at every VA. I use these people all the time. Let's say I have a vet that's moving to Michigan and I don't know anything about Michigan. I'll look up their care coordinator and kind of get things moving for them. So here's a link that includes all of the LGBT veteran care coordinators across the nation. Another point of note is that this directive explicitly prohibits any attempts to convert or change a veteran's sexual orientation. So there is a clause in here that explicitly prohibits conversion therapy in any form. May seem basic, but again, with policy, it's always nice to kind of have these things in writing to fall back on when you're doing advocacy work with LGBTQ veterans. And then lastly, the directive actually states that providers should ask veterans about sexual orientation and behavior as part of routine healthcare. So this really is something that providers are supposed to be doing routinely. Again, we know that policy doesn't always match up with behavior. But again, I think the in-between there is where a lot of advocacy can happen. So if you're trying to get colleagues to start doing these things and you can kind of point to a policy like, hey, we're supposed to be doing these things, I think that can sometimes be useful. Okay, so moving on to services for trans, intersex, non-binary, et cetera, veterans, we actually offer a ton of services. This is often surprising, I think, definitely to veterans and also to non-VA providers. So I don't want to spend too much time on each of these, but I'll just point out a few. So we provide comprehensive mental health services, including, for example, the groups that I run at VA Connecticut. The VA does provide hormone replacement therapy. And so again, this is an area where a lot of advocacy that I'm involved in and that a lot of other amazing people are involved in, trying to get providers up and running to be willing to provide HRT. Ideally, this could be done through primary care. It just kind of depends on who's willing to do it. But luckily, we have a great endocrinology department at VA Connecticut that manages all of that. We provide any type of letter writing services. So if a veteran needs a letter for getting surgery outside of the VA or getting hormones or any of that, we will do that. We provide a lot of really, really cool prosthetics. And just to like shout out, one of my current interns spent a lot of time this year putting together this very spiffy guide. Again, to help providers feel more comfortable having these conversations with veterans. People will reach out to me a lot and say, you know, I think my veteran wants a wig, but I don't even know how to talk about that. And so a lot of the work, again, is just getting providers kind of up to speed that yes, we do offer these things, and also like it's just a normal conversation, and here's some ideas about how to have the conversation with the veteran. We offer some reproductive care. We have had a lot of really exciting success recently getting veterans hooked up with electrolysis. Again, no cost to them, so veterans have been really excited about that. We offer speech therapy, so if veterans want to change the pitch of their voice to be more gender affirming, we do that in-house. We do preoperative and postoperative care, but the zinger here is that VA does not currently provide nor pay for gender affirming surgeries. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but basically the Veterans Benefits Package was determined by Congress. It's a law. And so currently gender affirming surgery is written into that as an exclusion. The other notable one that people typically ask about is abortion. A similar kind of deal. It's written in here as an exclusion. Okay, 2 more points about this directive. So number 1, it states that veterans should be addressed based on their gender identity. So it doesn't matter what's on the chart. It doesn't matter what they look like. Of course, it shouldn't anyway, but it actually is written here that we should be referring to veterans with the name and pronouns that they want. And again, this is really good for advocacy because I'm guessing a lot of you have sat in team meetings where people are sitting around talking about a patient and you know they're using the wrong name or the wrong pronouns, or you know a patient leaves your office and then goes to the front desk and you kind of know that that's not how they want to be addressed. So again, it's nice to sometimes be able to fall back on policy. Similarly, this also goes for room assignments and access to bathrooms. So it is federal law that any veteran is entitled to use whatever bathroom is consistent with their gender. Unfortunately, one of my first experiences on internship was I was working in the women's clinic at the Durham VA Medical Center. And this was the time of House Bill 2. So this was when everyone was arguing about, you know, whether trans people should be allowed to use their bathrooms. And the bill did eventually pass. And unfortunately, it was just an incredibly highly charged kind of environment. And there was a trans woman who was attempting to use her bathroom in the women's clinic, and a male veteran tried to stop her, and it got physical, unfortunately. And I certainly didn't know about this policy then, and I think a lot of other people around didn't know either. My supervisors definitely didn't know. And so again, like this is something that veterans can fall back on. This is federal policy. And the cool thing is it doesn't matter what laws these states try and pass, every VA goes by federal law. So every veteran can use their bathroom. Okay, and then recent changes. So I just got done talking about surgery. So yay, we're hopefully getting surgery now. And this really does mean a lot to a lot of trans veterans. So a year ago, Pride Month a year ago, Biden made the decision that the VA is now going to move towards actually paying for or performing gender affirming surgery. So it's very exciting, but we also try and modulate our veterans' expectations. So we're telling people probably like 2 to 3 years would be about when we're actually going to see this start happening. But regardless, just know, like, seeing trans veterans' reactions to this and how important it is to them that, you know, their government and the military that they risk their lives for is affirming who they are is just really means the world. Okay, and then finally, just a little plug, if anyone has like waiting rooms or works in colleges or anywhere that you need resources. I have like probably way too many resources. So please feel free to reach out. We have like tons of pamphlets, etc. Just for getting the word out about VA services for LGBT vets. Okay, so moving more to some more specific clinical work stuff. So as mentioned, I currently supervise 2 groups. The LGBTQ veteran support group is open to any veteran who identifies anywhere under the queer umbrella, including questioning. And then the trans/gender expansive group is specific to gender. So, trans, non-binary, et cetera. And these are both weekly groups for an hour. And they are very long-standing groups. So they've been in place for years. And this is not typically kind of what we shoot for in therapy, right? Like we want, kind of a clear start and end point. But I think that this format suits this population really, really well, especially in terms of just building like a sense of community and a long-standing spot for veterans to go. And so within this context, I supervise psychology interns, psychology fellows, and then psychiatry residents who kind of do the groups. And then we all meet together once a week as well for an hour for LGBT didactic. So that's where a lot of more of the teaching happens. And so this is kind of where I start with a lot of veterans who are new, a lot of LGBTQ veterans who are kind of new to services, is really trying to break down their life in terms of pre-military, military, and post-military, and think about their experiences, of course, but also the messages that they received about their identities, about their race, about their sexuality throughout a lifetime, because this is really how we're going to start to unpack all of that. So just as like a example, case example, so if you think about, let's say a 55-year-old cisgender gay male white veteran, if we're looking at the pre-military portion, he was raised very Catholic, very conservative, lots of messages about what it means to be a man, a lot of, homosexuality is a sin. He kind of learns that emotions are a sign of weakness, and the only way to deal with them is to either shove them down or use substances. He then joins the military. He's not out as gay at this point to anyone but himself. He experiences military sexual trauma from another man. So he's assaulted by a man. He is having a lot of thoughts about, is this because I'm gay, even though I'm not out? Did I do something to deserve this? Is something wrong with me? He gets discharged because of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So someone actually tracks him to a gay bar that he actually had never been inside of, but there were photos of him outside of this gay bar that were turned into his superior, and he was discharged from the military. So then many, many years pass. He doesn't seek any kind of treatment. He kind of comes out, he's mostly in the closet, lots of shame, lots of drinking, lots of suicidality. And then he shows up to us, right? And so I do this with all the veterans that I see, is just try and break things down this way. And the really awesome thing about doing a group is that they relate on so many things that I could never understand, especially this military piece. And so I think the fact that they're healing with queer people who are also veterans is really powerful. So thinking about some themes. Number one, so again, thinking about this kind of this last green box here, the post-military and the VA. Unfortunately, we know that a lot of queer people who seek help or attempt to seek help within the VA or not within the VA experience a lot of discrimination, trauma, microaggressions from seeking medical help. We know that veterans with multiple marginalized identities are more likely to have worse experiences, right? So queer veterans of color are likely dealing with even more discrimination. And so my first kind of strategy or recommendation would be to ask the person about this off the bat. So ask them what it's like, what their experiences have been engaging with medical systems. They might say, it's been great. I love the VA. It's wonderful. And if that's the case, that's great, right? We can move to the next thing. But more often than not, they're going to have some stories. And often I find that people are pretty confused. They're not really understanding why these things are happening to them. And so if that is the case for your person, I think after asking about their experiences, it can be really powerful for us as psychologists to explicitly name some of the ways that our field has contributed to oppression for our patients, for our current patients, and also kind of throughout history. And then to really invite the client to explore this distrust, right? And validate that it makes sense why you wouldn't want to go see your doctor. I think sometimes we kind of shy away from talking about aspects of our profession that maybe we're embarrassed of, or we think maybe is not appropriate to speak to a client with. But I found that it's actually the opposite, because people already know it's happening, right? Just because you're not bringing it up doesn't mean that they haven't experienced it. And then within those conversations are just so many rich opportunities for you to potentially advocate for your veteran, and for your veteran to find ways to empower themselves. So we do so much in group about, how do I set boundaries with a provider? How do I even use coping skills to get through an examination? How do I request a different provider if it gets to that point? So a lot of that, like, self-advocacy. Another major clinical theme is the interaction of our identities with our patients' identities. And so the associated strategies here, number one, which I'll talk more about later, but we want to engage in a constant process of self-assessment, introspection, examination, and consultation with other people, and especially other professionals who are different from us. Again, I think this audience probably does that, right? I'll talk about a couple tools that I use for that in a little bit. But then the second piece of this is to bring this up with your patients. And this is the part that sometimes gets like some eyebrow raises from people. Like, I'm supposed to talk about my identities with my patient. But it doesn't need to be, like overly self-disclosing. An example could be even, just like a little sentence, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, like, I recognize that, for example, let's say I'm cisgender and I can't imagine what it's like to be trans sometimes, but I really do want to understand. And I hope that this is a space where we can talk about that. And please tell me, if I'm missing something. Easy as that. And I kind of learned this the hard way, because it will come up and it will come out later in therapy. And if you've kind of laid the foundation for this, those conversations are just so much easier. I won't go too much into this case example for the sake of time, but for a while we had one Black veteran in group, and this was when I was a postdoc, and racism, of course, came up in group, and there were a lot of microaggressions, and the facilitators had not talked about our identities, had not talked about the fact that there was only one person of color in the room. And so it just became really kind of explosive. Whereas if you have those conversations up front, it can be just so much more smooth. And also, like, what we don't ask about in therapy, I think, is almost more important than what we do ask about. And we're sending really clear messages to our patients with the questions that we avoid. My personal pet peeve, be mindful of ivory tower language. I'm guilty of this, but like, I think we as a field need to talk as humans more and like stop using big words. Okay. Another theme that comes up constantly is safety. This is why I chose the title that I did. So someone asked me recently, what's the hardest part of my job? And I thought a lot about it. And this is the hardest part, which is that, you know, as people become more out, more proud, more authentic, they simultaneously are becoming more and more at risk. Not always, but I'm, you know, keenly aware of in group, you know, we're pumping up our trans woman vet to like wear the wig that she loves. And I know what the VA hallways are sometimes like, right? I know she might be in danger if she does wear that wig. And so clinically, the way that I tackle this is a lot of values work. So I've borrowed a lot from acceptance and commitment therapy, figuring out what are your values, what is your life worth living, and what level of risk are you willing to tolerate in order to live that life. And again, this has to be always the veteran's choice, right? And then I just stuck in here, kind of recognize the limitations of traditional psychotherapy. For example, you know, in CBT, we focus a lot on dysfunctional cognitions, but, you know, a lot of what marginalized people go through and are afraid of is very rational. It's not dysfunctional. And so asking them to change their thinking about it is invalidating and just sometimes doesn't help. And so, you know, of course, not to say that like queer people shouldn't do CBT or PTSD treatment, because of course they should, but we can help with that a lot just by recognizing those limitations. Another theme that really like can't be highlighted too much is the isolation that a lot of queer people are experiencing. I remember before Christmas, I asked our trans group, like, can everyone think of one person they consider a friend? And I think 1 out of like 6 people could actually do that. And sometimes I just forget kind of the level of it, you know? And so strategies for that, group is wonderful, right? Because we can build community within group. Also just being aware of local resources, if you can hook your person up with the local Pride Center or any type of you know, community building. And then we do a lot of techniques from interpersonal processing therapy in group. So we spend a lot of time just on like, what is it like to provide support to someone else? What is it like to receive support? What is it like to ask for support? Things that I think like a lot of humans aren't great at all the time, but that my veterans really seem to struggle a lot with. Familial rejection, harm, you know, family harm. Again, you know, we would treat this the same way we would treat any person who's dealing with these things. But two strategies that have been really helpful for me are helping the veteran figure out a chosen family. So teaching them what that is, teaching them that they deserve a family regardless of the way their blood family treats them. And helping them identify those people that could be a part of their family. And then also one of my favorite exercises, a lot of queer people, especially if they have experienced a lot of family rejection, feel like they're just kind of one person, just kind of floating around on earth. And they don't feel kind of a connection to their family. And so we talk a lot about choosing your own ancestors. And we, like one thing we did last week was we brought in a lot of pictures of like big events in queer history and just taught about who these people are. And these are your ancestors. Like you're actually a part of a family that's brilliant and like creative and some of, you know, the most interesting and cool people. And so if people can identify ancestors to look up to, that can be kind of a pretty powerful experience too. And then self-love, you know, not surprisingly, again, a lot of commonalities with every other therapy that we do. But we do a lot of inner critic work. Last week we were drawing our inner critic and identifying what the critic is saying, stuff like that. We do a lot of letter writing, actually. Our veterans, for some reason, like to write a lot, which is great. So we do things like picture your first coming out experience that was really, really bad. And then write, let's say it was with your dad, write a letter from your dad and write what you wish he had said to you in that moment. And it always brings up so much, and just like kind of, for lack of a better word, forcing the veteran to say nice things to themselves in that traumatic moment really brings up a lot. And then just tons of compassion work, mindfulness, all of that good stuff. Okay, another huge theme is microaggressions. I know we're all like very aware of what these are at this point. And then I put the Sue article in here just because I read this with trainees every year, and we role play what to do because it's hard when you're in the moment, right? And you're really anxious. But some particular brands of microaggressions that we might be less used to happen to come up a lot in groups. So the first one of these is when a patient is microaggressing on themselves. So they're saying things typically because of their internalized homophobia or internalized racism or whatever it might be. But things that are pretty offensive to themselves. And it's really complicated, right? Like, how do you don't want to tell a veteran how to speak ever, or like how to speak to themselves, or what words to use towards themselves, but you also do want to unpack that. And when you're in a group, if they're microaggressing on themselves, they're likely saying things that are gonna be microaggressions to other people in the room as well. So it's really, really important to mindfully intervene. Patient on patient microaggressions just come up probably at least once a group. And then patient on trainees, that I think we're a little more familiar with that one. You know, trainees unfortunately get harassed. But so just to give a brief example of a patient microaggressing on themselves. So I had a Vietnam veteran, I want to say she was she was pretty old. She was like 79, I think. She was a trans woman. She was from a different time. She grew up in a different world. And so she would often use words that were outdated, and she would often refer to herself as a tranny. And when she first started saying this, I wasn't really sure if it was derogatory. And again, I don't want to tell her like, no, don't use that word, because sometimes patients find power in words, and I don't ever want to take that away. But more it came out, she added more derogatory words to it. She was referring to herself as like a silly tranny or like an ugly tranny at one point. And so we unpacked this in group. And the cool thing was that I was able to use the other veterans there to really help her process this word. So other veterans would say, how does it make you feel when you hear the word tranny? How does it make you feel when you hear a trans woman use the word tranny about herself? And so I think my strategy that I would add here at the bottom to all the Sue strategies is to really try and narrow in on the emotion underlying the microaggression. Group can get super heated, and a lot of times you do have to just call a timeout, especially if someone's really, really microaggressing. I think mostly when I have to call a timeout is when racism is happening and I have to just shut it down. So there are times when you can't process the underlying emotion, but often you really can kind of zoom in on what's happening underneath what the veteran is actually saying, and that's where the meat of it and the learning can occur. Politics. So we all know the quote, the personal is political. Again, if we're telling a patient they can't talk about politics, whether we're saying that out loud or whether we're sending implicit messages about this, we're telling a lot of them that they can't show up as their full selves in the therapy room. And so I really, really, again, encourage everyone to not shy away from politics. And so in terms of strategies, sometimes ways to start the conversation can be as simple as coming into therapy and being like, phew, there's a lot going on in the world, and then just, if they are like, what are you talking about? Then you skip it. But if they're like, yeah, I just saw that news story. And then you can really dive in. And again, this is scary in groups when people disagree a lot, right? But again, like I really try and encourage trainees to not shy away from it. It's important to set boundaries, but we really don't want to tell patients that they can't talk about politics. And again, my strategy is always go to the underlying emotion. So recently in group, we've been talking a lot about, you know, the anti-trans legislation, and specifically sports seems to be a very heated issue. And in trans group, people are pretty split. So we've got a lot of trans people who are saying, no, I think it's unfair. I don't think a boy should be allowed to compete against girls. Speaking of like microaggressions against themselves, right? And so it's a pretty hot button issue. And like, yeah, my stomach does hurt a little bit when it comes up in therapy, but there's just so much underlying, there's so many emotions, and there's so much learning that can happen there. So that's my spiel about politics. The VA is a little complicated. I've just mentioned the Hatch Act because again, this is something that there's a ton of misunderstanding around. The Hatch Act is a federal law that says that VA employees or federal employees cannot engage in certain political activities while at work. This has unfortunately been interpreted by some people as we aren't allowed to talk about politics, which is not the case at all. And so there's a lot of fear surrounding the Hatch Act, but specifically, we're not allowed to talk about political candidates. We're not allowed to engage in like political fundraising, stuff like that, but we're absolutely allowed to talk about things going on in the news. And veterans really want and need to talk about this stuff. Okay, and lastly, yes, that's the last slide. Pronouns. People may be sick of hearing about pronouns. I can tell you though, that this is still, I think if I had to pick an issue that like we could use allies more than anything on, it's pronouns. And I can tell you that I stood at the VA Pride booth at the VA last week, and there's a lot of real confusion and mistrust and anger surrounding pronouns. It's become a really political issue. So people loved our rainbow bags, they loved our rainbow lanyards, but then when they got to the spot where it said, here's a pin where you write your pronouns, a lot of people were like, oh no, I don't do that, or they made me do that at my last job. And pronouns are actually the #1 thing that trans veterans say when asked, like, what's it like to get care at the VA? Their #1 complaint is just providers are not using my pronouns. So just like such a huge area that we desperately need allies. Okay, I'm not going to go into this. In case anyone is interested in starting their own LGBT group, I just added these resources in here. Annalise Singh is a brilliant, I think they're a psychologist. Yeah, so they've done a lot of work. They're queer, they're not cis. So just throwing this out there if anyone is interested in a resource. Okay, and then part 3. Am I ending at 7:50? It's 7:50. Okay.
Yeah, we usually allow 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So
okay, yes, so that's perfect. So I'll do this slide, and then the rest will mostly be resources. So in thinking about being a supervisor and treating LGBT patients and also working with LGBT trainees or any trainee that doesn't share all of your identities, which is usually the case, right? I think a lot of us in the helping profession got into this to help people, which is certainly noble. And the reason I absolutely love this paper is it's kind of shifting the perspective a little bit on that paradigm. So as we start to engage in this process of self-reflection, we identify our areas of privilege, but we also identify ways that the gender binary or even just society or, you know, any aspects of society has shaped us or has limited us as a person. So instead of thinking about it as an us versus them, we're thinking about more of a shared liberation approach here. So we're all on the same team, and we're all fighting for the same world and the same goals. And so this quote here that I love fits perfectly. If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. If you've come because your liberation is bound with mine, let us work together. And I think that could be a pretty powerful shift for our profession with gender, but really with anything, right? Okay, so speaking of Annalise Singh, they also have this model of supervision that I'm not going to get into, but the paper is linked here. You're welcome to kind of dive into it. The pieces of it that are most important, I think, are number one at the top here, the supervisor-focused personal development, which I've touched on, and then the supervisee-focused personal development. Just really, really vital, right? And then throughout all stages of supervision, there's awareness of privilege and oppression and an affirmation on diversity. So the whole clinical relationship and the whole relationship with your trainee is full of diversity, right? It's not just kind of an aspect of it. It's not just one course. It's not just one day on the syllabus. I'm going to skip this. This is if people need a resource for kind of where to start doing a cultural self-assessment. Just some basic questions here that you can ask to yourself. And I do ask trainees to go through each of these and write down responses, and then we talk about them together. I'm guessing people have seen the addressing model, but again, this is just a tool if you need some type of framework to start thinking about your identities. I also do ask trainees to sit down and think through this, and then we talk about it together. Again, just as a tool. The great thing about trainees is that if they don't like something and you empower them, they'll tell you what they don't like about it. So much learning can occur there. Okay, and this is going to be my last slide, I promise. So in terms of themes and strategies, these are kind of like my themes. Number one, don't ignore elephants in the room. Again, what we're not saying is just so important, and trainees are paying attention. They're looking to us for what they can talk about with us and what they can't talk about with us. If we're not bringing up our identities, they're probably not going to bring it up, right? Really important to address power differentials early and often. I think I have a lot to say about that, but I'll just leave it at that. Clearly explain how you're going to be evaluating people. So when you make trainees feel comfortable to talk about themselves, a lot could come out. A lot of experiences of discrimination. A lot of the times trainees will start telling you about experiences of harassment they've had at your site or from some of your coworkers. A lot of this stuff does come out, and it's good, right? Because if they're not talking about it with us, who do they have to work through it with, right? And so we want that, but we just have to make them very aware of, how this could impact them and the limits to confidentiality. Asking for feedback, and then finally, modeling vulnerability in a very intentional way, meaning let them know that we have feelings that come up in this work, but don't make them responsible for our feelings. So help them process their feelings through modeling, but don't make them kind of make you feel better about who you are. Lastly, just want to say happy Pride to everyone. And before I finally stop talking, just acknowledge out loud that the first Pride was a protest, it was a riot. Our queer ancestors of color led the charge because they were being persecuted by police. Unfortunately, that still is happening today. Our queer brothers and sisters of color are continuing to be targeted, with violence and police brutality. So we have to work on that. And there's no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. And then, of course, our other queer ancestor, Audre Lorde, said life is very short and what we have to do must be done in the now. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Lots and lots of questions. Information and questions. So before everything, I received just a question. I couldn't copy paste it. I'm going to share it with you, Georgina. One of the participants is asking about the sports and transgenders. Would you please let us know how to get more information or provide some information about this?
Sure. Yeah, I think probably the best place to start would be to go to the ACLU, who's fighting a lot of these battles, just for kind of a blanket explanation. So a lot of I shouldn't say a lot, but some states are trying to make it so that trans kids have to play a certain sport. So let's say there's a trans girl that wants to play on the girls' soccer team. She's not allowed. She has to play with the boys because she quote unquote has a boy's body, and it wouldn't be fair. And so this is, this is one of the many debates that is raging. And what really is the purpose of, do people really care that much about what sports team the kids play on? And do they really actually want to legalize transphobia? I don't know. But what I do know is that the toll that this hearing about these battles and hearing, all of the things that people have to say about trans people does take a toll on trans people. And I don't work with trans kids, but I can only imagine the toll that takes on them as well. So, but I would start with ACLU, and then if you Google it, there's a ton of stuff out there.
Thank you. Any other questions?
We have a question in the chat, Georgina, if you want, I can read it aloud or you can read it aloud.
Yes, so how do you navigate your clinical work and your identity? What have you found most useful as a queer clinician? I found it difficult to share my pronouns and correct the misgendering. Thank you so much. Yes, this is really, really hard. I am so lucky because I literally only work with queer patients. So I'm very protected. If I share my pronouns, usually the person's like, thank you so much. I don't have to deal with, a lot of the negative reactions that I bet a lot of other clinicians in a lot of other settings do. What I kind of fall back on is, for the VA, for me, my goal is to make the VA welcoming and safe for every single veteran. And so if I have let's say, I used to work with some straight veterans. So let's say I have a straight veteran who's uncomfortable with the question. So I kind of have my spiel ready. And I would encourage everyone to think through what your spiel is going to be. If you ask a veteran or a patient their pronouns and they say, ugh, what is that? Or I can't believe you asked me that, to kind of have your spiel prepared. So I just say something like, yeah, how do people refer to you when you're not there? Do they say he? Do they say she? Do they say they? And a lot of times people will just kind of give in and just pick one. If they fight it more, then I'll go into just some more psychoeducation about this is what pronouns are. And this is very important because I need to make sure that my therapy room is an affirming space for everyone. And most people, especially veterans, really care about each other and don't give me too much pushback. It's a deeper question too about how do I navigate my identity, but finding things that I'm sure of that I can always fall back on when I'm feeling unsure or anxious, that's kind of my go-to, if that makes sense. Sorry. Oh, okay, that's not a question. Do you mind giving an example of how to disarm a microaggression and how do you educate without feeling of need to be the spokesperson? For the second part, this is why I love doing groups. It's my favorite type of therapy because half the time you don't have to be the spokesperson because other veterans will do it and you can just kind of steer the ship. And it's just my favorite thing in the world. An example of how to disarm a microaggression. So let's stick with the tranny example that I gave. If you read the Sue article that I pasted in there, it's great because it really does give you a lot of different examples of potential responses. So my favorite first go-to is a nonverbal. So sometimes I'll just be like, kind of like indicate like, oh, I'm kind of confused. Like, what does that mean? Or, indicate some type of something. Once you get to know your patients, they read you so well, half the time you don't even have to speak, right? So that's kind of the lowest level of intervention. If I need to take it up a notch, I'll say something like, oh, I noticed that you used the word tranny. That's not a word that I think a lot of trans people think is okay to use. Can you tell me a little bit more about why you said that? And then kind of escalate the intervention all the way up to the most extreme intervention would be what I mentioned of just kind of calling a timeout and saying, we cannot use this word here. because this group needs to be a safe space for everyone. I really don't have to do that a lot. But again, that's kind of my fallback on is you absolutely cannot say that word in this room. But that's like a really intense intervention that I would only use if, you know, it had gotten intense, if that makes sense.
Awesome. Thank you. At this time,
I also, may I ask just a quick question?
Yeah, very quick.
So Georgina, you know, sometimes trans women have some pain when they are going to speech therapy to change their pitch. So I'm wondering if we have services in Connecticut to make the referrals for transgender women.
That's such a good question, and I'm not good at things that are outside of VA, but I can definitely look into that for you. I'm assuming that I think it's becoming more integrated into speech pathology training, depending on your program. At least that's what our speech pathologist tells me here. But in terms of specific referrals, I'll have to do some digging for you.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Jenna.
No, that's okay. I recognize that we are close to time, and there is a question in the chat about building community, and perhaps folks, it can stay after if you're willing, Georgina, to respond to this question. I just want to respect people's time and have an ending point at 8 p.m. as promised. I will just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Gross, for sharing your brilliance, your resources, for giving us language, for reminding us the power of community, especially when working with this population, and really reminding us to be self-reflective in all of the work that we do as clinicians, researchers, advocates, educators, and so forth. And so I learned a lot personally, and I just really want to say thank you for your time. As a quick nudge for next month, our next speaker series will be July 28th at 7 p.m. in which Dr. Mona Amir will be joining us. And the title of her talk is Islamophobia and the Muslim American Mental Health. I also just want to say thank you to everyone who continues to donate to this series. We greatly appreciate all the fundraising activities and your generous donations to keep this work going. We do have some links that will pop in the chat. One, for those who are here for CE credit, there is a post survey that you do for your CE to evaluate our talk this evening. We also have a link related to this talk specifically that really helps us as a planning committee plan future sessions and be really specific to the needs of our community and CPA members who want to learn more about issues related to social justice. Apologies. I will end there. I will post those links in the chat. Thank you all for joining. We hope to see you next month. Have a safe evening.